Namaskar to all of you. So you're going to hear the next lecture in the series that the Sankara Academy of Vision has started. Uh, uh, this talk would be on good clinical practice, overview, and ethical principles. So before we proceed further, I would like to inform you that although we say good clinical practice, it is actually good clinical research practice, because it is more applicable to research rather than practice. It's all about documentation, which is also a required aspect for keeping the clinical records as well. But when we talk of GCP, it is in the in context of research. So, what was the background of this ICH-GCP? What do you mean by that? So it was initially International Conference of Harmonization. Why was this actually brought in? Because globally, the drug market was a big market and every country had its own laws and regulations. And there was a lot of problem in trying to market new drugs internationally, because it was very time consuming and expensive, because every country had its own regulations. So if you are going to do it for US, then you have to follow US FDA guidelines. If you do it for EU, you have to follow the EU guidelines and so on. So it was felt that one needs to actually harmonize all these and then bring it to one common frame, which will reduce the costs of the healthcare also, because the products will come into the market fast and people were actually expecting that when all the existent therapies are exhausted. So people are very eager to see if there is anything new in the horizon. So this process actually would reduce that time lag. And the main purpose, of course, was to harmonize the regulations and guidelines for drug development. And what are they actually? The three biggies. The United States, Europe, and Japan came together to do this exercise. They had 6 sponsors from each region and other memberships from health authorities and pharmaceutical companies, besides representatives from WHO, Canada, Nordic Group, and Australia. This was the story when they brought it out in 1996. So what did it address? Actually, it was related to new medical products like drugs, biologicals, devices. And the data, the safety, quality, and efficacy was the prime requirement for the data management. So for this purpose, they actually came together to find a unified standard framework having similar rules to conform to high scientific and ethical standards. And these standards pertained to design, conduct, recording, monitoring, analysis, and reporting. So this is the official website of ICH-GCP. After it came out in 1996, it was actually renamed as International Council for Harmonization. So till such time that they were making the guidelines, it was conference, because they were meeting together. But don't think that they stopped with that. They continued to do their work, and we will talk about it a little while later. So the major categories that they identified were quality, safety, efficacy, multidisciplinary. In each category, you had the topic codes. And these topic codes for quality was chemical and pharmaceutical quality assurance. Safety, it was for in vitro and in vivo preclinical testing. And efficacy was clinical studies in humans. And this is where we are going to concentrate in this talk. Multidisciplinary is all about quality of the data that you get, the use of electronic data, softwares, etc. So under quality, we have 9 codes. So we will not go into detail about this because this doesn't pertain to the research area. So safety, research means what I meant was human research. And safety topics were 8 in number, and efficacy were 15 in number, but it is E6 which we are going to concentrate on. Now, the GCP, which came out in 1996, got termed as R1, and when they revised it and released it in 2016, it became R2. So this is what I was telling, that they were not quiet. They went on working, and even now they are working, and they have now, among many countries, they have India also as a representative in that group. So when we come to the 13th principles of ICH-GCP, to start with at 2.1, we talk about compliance to ethics and regulations. And generally, because many countries which are developing drugs, they are to actually comply with this if they don't have their own GCP guidelines. So it is generally stated that they should conduct the research in accordance with ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. So when we talk of our country, the Indian GCP in particular, the researchers will have to follow the ICMR's ethical guidelines and the regulations which are in vogue right now. So when we come to beneficence, 2.2, it is talking about the or stating the foreseeable risks and inconvenience that you may come across, and these should be weighed against anticipated benefits to justify the risks. So that is about beneficence. And then the protection of the participant, 2.3, that is RSW. That means the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial subjects, which is most important consideration when you do research, and it should prevail over the interests of the science and society. Now, one should actually have adequate prior data, and 2.4 actually describes that. So whatever data you have with you on the non-clinical research that you have done in vitro, in vivo, and the clinical information. Suppose you are going to do phase 2 study, then you need to have phase 1 data as well. So all that you have collected so far, before venturing into the next phase, you have to actually have that projected to argue that you're going into the next phase of the clinical trial, or the proposed one. So relevant science should be there. Scientifically sound proposal means it is partly ethically sound. Bad science means bad ethics. So 2.5 actually highlights this, that they should be scientifically sound. And next one is about the independent review. So 2.6 states that it should be in compliance with the protocol. Whatever you do during the period of the trial should take care of that aspect. And it has to receive prior approval of IRB or IEC. So in our country, we generally use IEC or EC. So professional care, 2.7 talks about the responsibility of a qualified physician. So the physician cannot say that, okay, you are my participant. So whatever you encounter as a result of your medical after effects of having taken the intervention, that is not my concern. It should not be like that. The physician should be able to give the appropriate medical care, whatever is needed, when the participant or the subject is under your care as a participant or a research subject. And this is also applied to a qualified dentist. Now, GCP here highlights that GCP is meant only for qualified physician and qualified dentist, but it's not that the others don't come into the framework. So research is research. So whoever does it has to follow the good clinical practice. So professional expertise should be there for the investigator, and the investigator can become only a principal investigator if that person is qualified by education, training, and experience. Many a times we have seen that the students are actually named as principal investigator, which is not correct because the student is not qualified yet and does not have the training and the experience. So the guide will become the principal investigator in such cases, and the student will be student researcher. And when it comes to publication of the paper based on that research, naturally the student has to be the first author. Then you come to the another very important aspect, the informed consent. So 2.9 insists that the informed consent should be obtained from every subject or participant prior to clinical trial participation. And there should be appropriate documentation of all the information that you record. How you record it, how you handle it, and store it for accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification is very, very important aspect of ICH-GCP. So R2 that I had talked to you about, we will come to that later also. The revision of the GCP guidelines adds that applicability of GCP standards when using electronic media should be maintained. So in India, the records have to be maintained 5 years after completion or termination of trial for the regulatory trials. But for the academic trials, it can be 3 years. But it doesn't mean that they have to keep it only for that period. If the sponsor wants it for more than that, say 15 years, then you have to keep it for 15 years. So it depends on the demand of the sponsor for archiving. Privacy and confidentiality is 2.11 point, and this actually leads to the identification of the participant. So it should be protected, respecting the privacy and confidentiality in accordance with the whatever applicable regulatory requirements are there in that particular country. And in our country, we also have the audio-video recording of the participants. So even that comes under this point. So the product has to be GCP, GMP compliant. So one has to actually have the investigational product which has been actually manufactured, handled, or stored in accordance with the applicable GMP. So the quality assurance is what I was telling you, the last part, that the systems with procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. So what happened after the release of GCP in 1996? In 2002, between 2002 and 2012, the European Medical Agency found certain critical aspects which needed to be rectified. They found a lot of gaps in monitoring, data management, clinical study reports, and source documentation. Even in US, they found that there was inadequate monitoring. They studied it from 2007 to 2012. So there was inadequate monitoring, failure to bring investigators into compliance, and inadequate accountability for investigational product. So as a result of all that, again, discussions took place, and finally they added as the integrated Addendum to good clinical practice, and which was released in 2016. The need was that if GCP had to keep pace with the scale and complexity of clinical trials, because a lot of electronic media has come into play. You have now data which has to be actually sent electronically. There's a monitoring, we call it remote and centralized monitoring, and so on. So it has become much more complex than it used to be earlier. And a lot of paper exchange had stopped. It was more on electronic basis. So one needed to ensure that there was appropriate use of this technology. And also the quality management changed to risk-based approach. So a lot of emphasis was given to risk management. So the additions in the R2 version, the salient features were the requirement for use of limited resources, And as I told you earlier, risk-based and centralized monitoring came into play much more, and the validity of electronic records became very, very important. And it also led to flexibility to supplement or reduce the essential document list. Otherwise, there was a big essential document list. So the glossary added this, I'll just skip through very fast because these are only the points which are added in each part, like glossary, principles of GCP, investigator, and look at the responsibility of sponsor. So many added. And in that you can see from the slide itself that there's a lot of emphasis given to risk identification, risk evaluation, control, communication, review, reporting, etc. So then the oversight of subcontractor tasks also became a job for the sponsor. Use of computerized systems, because a lot of emphasis is given to electronic media. Use of electronic media, nature of monitoring, provision of monitoring results, monitoring, non-compliance, and so on. And the essential document, how you actually handle it, also got added. One more point added to that. There were no changes made to what was required from the Institutional Review Board of Clinical Trial Protocol and Amendments and the investigator's brochure. What I told you earlier about the information, prior information that you must have about the non-clinical and the clinical data, all that when it is compiled together for presentation for the present protocol is called investigator's brochure. So whose responsibility is it? So you can see that there are multiple stakeholders, sponsors, CRO, investigators, site staff, ethics committee, and regulatory authorities. Patients are in the center of the whole scheme. So this is just another representation of the same. And then what are the qualities that an investigator should have? So responsible, the mnemonic, you can see that the investigator should be really interested, should be ethical in activities, and also should educate oneself, must supervise regularly, should probe the progress and problems, should be open to discussions and audits, never leaves it to subordinates, and is deeply involved in the conduct of the trial, especially allocates time and personnel. That's very, very important when it comes to the investigator's role. And the investigator should be inquisitive and inquiring, should back up with source documentation whatever arguments are put forth, and live to the GCP standards and SOPs. Should earn reputation and recognition as a sequelae of a good investigator conducting a good research. What is the responsibility of ethics committee? So before trial, of course, it is review of the proposal and issue of approval, and also how you keep the minutes and the rest of the records. That's also very important for the ethics committee. During the trial, it actually should review whether the investigator is following the amendments that may have been done later, and also what is the reporting of adverse events and serious adverse events. Examine if there are any protocol deviations and assess the progress, because protocol deviations, number of protocol deviations actually cause an alert for the ethics committee to see whether they want to monitor that particular project or not. Ensure record keeping. So after trial, what happens? If the duty is not over, they have to actually review the study report and post-trial management, what was promised earlier, they have to check that aspect, and also oversee ethical publishing and ensure record keeping and archives. Many a times we see that the completion report is not submitted to the ethics committee, and it is the ethics committee's duty to see that the final report and the final closure report comes to the ethics committee for archiving. The sponsor's responsibility I had actually highlighted earlier that R2 had increased the responsibilities. But let us just see what this mnemonic entails. So it is the sponsor's responsibility to select the protocol, the investigator, and the institution. So that becomes a site. A good institution is actually one that the sponsors would like to go, but they must also know whether a PI is good enough for carrying out their research. We very often blame the sponsor for so many things, but one must also remember that it is the sponsor who comes to the rescue of ethics committee, because it asks the principal investigator for ethics approval, for annual progress report, whether they have been approved or not. And many a times the PI actually runs to the ethics committee office only when the sponsor wants the PI to actually submit such reports. So pursues the regulatory authorities, ethics committee, and principal investigator. The dealing with ethics committee is not direct at all, because they don't talk to each other, but it is through the principal investigator. The sponsor organizes trial logistics, negotiates medication supplies, contracts, and budget, supports education for PI, monitor, and auditor, and operationalizes the data management quality systems, and report safety and trial data to regulators. So there is this person called clinical research coordinator. Actually, this person is a friend of the research team at the site, because for every step, this person actually is responsible to check subject recruitment, enrollment tracking, how accurately the specimen is collected and sent for processing, has the subject been educated enough, and in some cases the family also may need education. Are the study medications administered properly? How is the data being managed? And also whether the CRF is completed, and also about other documents. There are three important roles for checking quality. And who are these people actually? Monitor, auditor, and inspector. You can see the one color for monitor and auditor just to depict that they both come from the side of the sponsor, and the inspector comes from the side of the regulators. The monitor actually, monitor and auditor do the same job, but there is slight difference. Monitor actually looks at the progress of clinical trial, and the auditor looks at the trial related activities. The inspector actually does the same in a broader manner, looks at the documents, but also goes to the sponsor besides the site, CRO, or other related establishments. So the monitor actually is responsible to actually check the investigators' qualification, expertise, resources, and availability. And also what are the institutional facilities like laboratories, equipment, trained staff, and storage space, etc. The investigational product, whether it is available, whether it is being supplied regularly. In COVID era, you know, everybody underwent a lot of difficulties in maintaining this supply chain of the interventions. So the proper handling of the product, receipt, use, return, and disposable, all these aspects pertain to the investigational product. The site and the PI, the responsibility of the monitor is to see whether they are using the current investigator's brochure. As I told you, there could be amendments. And when the amendments come, it is that version which should be used, not the earlier one. So the investigator follows the protocol agreement which they have with the PI, and maintains the essential documents, whether the PI maintains that or not, follows the GCP guidelines and the prescribed SOPs, and no delegation of any assigned function to unauthorized individuals. So we will see this in greater detail. As you know, the auditor actually sees the management team, risk management, external audit, internal audit, other services. So let us see the difference between auditing and monitor. If they are going to do the same job, what is the difference? Now, when you talk of monitor, look at the single tree there. So the monitor sees all the leaves, how many leaves are actually mature, how many new leaves have come, how tall is the tree, how broad is the tree. That means every aspect of the tree. Now compare that to the documents. So um, uh, 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 that is examination at the micro level. Whereas an auditor actually does not look at the trees. It looks at the person looks at the forest. So how is the forest? Is it having too much dry leaves? Is it looking healthy? Are the surrounding areas clean? So in other words, it's the macro level management. It's a broad outlook of what is happening at that particular site. And the monitor does the all the minute workup of that particular site's management of the research. So inspector, of course, as I told you, comes from the regulatory authority. And it actually overlooks both the sponsor as well as the ethics committee. But both sponsor and ethics committee actually are responsible how the site actually functions. So we talk about source data. This is very important when it comes to auditing, monitoring, etc. So as I told you, the monitor actually looks at the micro level details. So this word you must understand, it's called ALCOA. ALCOA means attributable. That is, whatever you record, it should be written there who actually recorded this, who modified it, and when was this done, what and why. This is important because your signature actually tells you who is the person who has done that and when was this done. So sign and date are very, very important. And why was it done? That also is very, very important because that shows that you are truthful. Legibility is very important. Doctors are famous for illegible handwriting, but here you have to be very, very careful because 3 can become 8, 8 can become 3. So that has to be looked into very carefully. As I told you, dates are very important. Suppose in this case also you have to see that there is no overwriting. If a mistake has been committed, which is human in nature, you always can make a mistake. So it doesn't matter. You just cut that and don't overwrite over that. You cut it and write over above that in clear figures or words and sign with date. Contemporaneous data should be recorded in real time, like you have forgotten to take the record to the OPD where you're supposed to observe all the details and all that. So you just take a piece of paper there and then you write everything there and then you take it back thinking that you will actually enter it into the records, and that may never happen. So in order to cut down on that possibility of missing the data, you are required to actually file that piece of paper where you had written that, sign it and put the date and put it in the record. So everybody knows that you had been honest enough, because every time you may not be very accurate with taking everything recorded in the real record. Once in a while you may commit a blunder. So you are admitting that you had noted it down in a paper and archived it. Original data should be captured and maintained. Accuracy is very important. You have to be honest about recording the collected data to show transparency, and it should be complete. Should not omit any details, because that actually leads to missing data, which actually leads to what you call the loss of resources and money and all that energy if your CRF is not up to date. and you lose that number which you actually require to make the sample size up to date. So good documentation criteria is actually honestly document everything that has happened, because if it is not written, it has not happened. That is a doctrine which is very often used for GCP, because they say that even if you swear by God or your mother or father, saying that I did it, you can ask the other members of the research team, or you can ask somebody else, I did it. But then you are coming as an auditor or monitor or inspector after some time, and you have not seen what you did. So what you see in the document is what you see. So if it is not written there, they will say that, okay, fine, it's not happened. So credible data validates results and provides audit trail. It captures unusual circumstances. These can always happen in any trial. And if there is a mistake, you have to do what they call corrective action and preventive action, CAPA. So whenever an error is made, you have to correct it in a timely manner. So provide proof of investigators' compliance to applicable guidelines and regulations. And this is just a comparison of Indian GCP, which was made in 2001, which was based on ICH-GCP, WHO GCP, and ICMR guidelines, ethical guidelines of 2000 at that time. So comparing it with ICH E6, it had some differences. There were differences in definitions and certain terminologies. Instead of principles, they said prerequisites, IRB, IEC. Besides that, they had responsibility of sponsor, monitor, investigator added. And the investigator, with regard to that, record keeping and data handling was also the responsibility of the investigator. And for the sponsor, the quality assurance, protocol, statistics. And then the investigator's brochure, there were special concerns which were not there in ICH E6. That is about vaccines, contraceptives, surgical procedures, medical devices, diagnostic agents, radioactive materials and x-rays, and herbal remedies and medicinal plants. And besides that, we had the Schedule Y as the appendices. Now Schedule Y doesn't exist anymore after the release of or the Gazette notification of the new drug and clinical trials rules on 19th March 2019. So many things on the side of the Indian GCP are no longer relevant now. So there is actually an effort to, to actually revise the GCP guidelines, which is, I understand, is ready. It has to be seen by the regulator, and perhaps it may be released in 2020. This is important because, as I told you, Indian GCP was and part of the ICMR ethical guidelines was adopted in the Indian GCP. Now the ethical guidelines have been revised twice after that, and the latest one is in 2017. Besides that, we have now the new drug and clinical trial rules. So it's high time that the GCP, Indian GCP guidelines actually adapt to these changes. And that's what I said, that I understand that it's ready. But the regulator, actually the Drug Controller General of India, who is now to be termed as Central Licensing Authority, has to actually approve it. So with that, we come to the conclusion that for GCP, when we talk of GCP, there are only two primary goals. On one side, it is the protection of the right and welfare of the human research subjects. And on the other side, it is to ensure that the quality and integrity of the data that is obtained from clinical research is maintained. So when we talk of human research subjects, we must remember that in India, we call them participants. And I understand that presently, even ICH-GCP is actually discussing whether the word subject should be changed into participants. because world over this change has been made, but in some of the developed countries it is still maintained as subject. Subject means subjugative in a doctor-patient relationship. But when it comes to research versus participant, they are actually partners. So that's why you give them the dignity as participants and not subjects. With that, I thank you all for a patient listening.